"Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, one evening, Martha and Paul, they were sitting on this porch swing outside their house, and Martha asked Paul to go out and to go to the store and buy her an ice cream sundae with some chocolate syrup. And so he got up and he's like, "Well, I'll remember to do that." And Martha said, "No, write it down or you will forget." And this went back and forth for a little while, but Paul didn't write it down because he was adamant that he would not forget. He would remember. So he finally went down to the store and he comes back and he hands Martha a bag. She opens it up and she pulls out a delicious ham sandwich. She looked at him angrily and said, "Paul, I knew you'd forget. I asked for mustard, not mayonnaise." See, we all forget things from time to time, don't we? Whether it's names, faces, where we put something, words even sometimes we forget. We are a forgetful people. And if I think you could summarize the entire journey of Israel in the Old Testament in one word, it would be forgetful. They forgot over and over again who God was. They forgot what God had done for them. They forgot his promises. And as we look through the Old Testament, we see the failure of Israel, and it's not too long before we really realize that we are just as forgetful as them. It'd be nice to look at the stories of the Old Testament and see these great characters like Noah and Abraham and Joseph, Moses, Joshua and David, and think that's me in that story, but it never is. We aren't those characters. It's God who sends these people that were to show us who Jesus Christ was. We are the scared Israelites sitting on the sidelines, forgetting who God was. How often we forget, just like Israel. We're going to be kind of moving through a large section here. If you want to keep up, you can. There's also notes online that have a lot of these texts in them. But if you remember way back in the book of Genesis, in chapter 12, God called Abraham to leave his homeland and to go to a new land that he would show him. Then in chapter 13, verses 14 to 17, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham and showed him where this land was going to be. And then again in 15, verses 18 to 21, he says, "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, to the land of the Kenites and Kenzites and Cabanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.'" So he sends them to this land, right? He tells them where this promised land would be for his descendants. And so this promise was passed down to Isaac, and it was passed down to Jacob, who would be later renamed Israel. And Israel's son, Joseph, ends up in Israel. If you remember the story, his brothers sell him there, and through incredible work that God does, he ends up coming up with this incredible plan to stop and save all these people from the famine to come, as he stores the food, and he gets put into this high-ranking position, and Israel moves to Egypt. And while in Egypt, we're told in Exodus chapter 1 that they eventually became slaves. Exodus 1, 8 to 11 says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses." So Israel ends up in slavery. They end up being in Egypt, if you do all the math, for a total of 215 years. And if you'd like to know more about that math, in the notes there's a link to an article by Answers in Genesis that works through how exactly all those numbers work together, if that's the type of information you really enjoy. And so we learn then in the book of Exodus at the beginning about Moses, whom God saved from birth, and he leads the people out into the promised land as God inflicts these 10 plagues that cripple the superpower that was Egypt. As Israel escapes Egypt, they take everything. Exodus 12:35-36. The people of Israel had done as Moses told them, and they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold, jewelry, and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. This superpower, this crazy rich nation, right? From years prior to that, when Joseph had saved them from the famine, all of the people and all of these nations came to Egypt and bought food. And Israel bought everything. They owned Egypt just started buying everything. They had all this wealth, and Israel plunders them. And so God leads Israel out, and he leads them to the edge of the wilderness. And Pharaoh, he decides to change his mind again, and he pursues Israel because he has them trapped between the army and the Red Sea. And in Exodus 10-14, it says, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us to bring us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. And so if we remember what happens, God delivers the people of Israel. He opens up the Red Sea. He puts a cloud behind them to slow down and stop the Egyptians. The people cross safely through it. And as the Egyptians start to chase them, the sea crashes down and kills them all. And so this is where we're at in the story as we jump into Exodus chapter 15. The people of God are standing at the edge of the wilderness, the Red Sea behind them. And they have seen God's amazing plan unfold. It's been 430 years since God made the promise to Abraham. It seems a little bit like a crazy plan, doesn't it? When you go all the way through everything, all the way from the beginning, back to where Abraham was, and you go through the whole book of Genesis, and then you get halfway through the book of Exodus, and you're like, wow, God, you took a really long time to give him this promised land. So many things happened. Your hand was involved in so many different ways. We need to remember that God's ways are always better than our ways. We need to remember that his plans are always more complex than we could ever imagine. He sees things ways that we will never see or understand. Israel left Egypt as a large nation, which just plundered the richest and most powerful nation in the world. They left with silver, gold, clothing, livestock. They left equipped for battle. They had just seen, the whole nation had just seen and experienced the saving power of God as they got out of Egypt through the plagues and then through the Red Sea. We're told that the whole nation feared God. They knew that God was with them and that no other army could stop them. This was a testimony that we learn later on in the book of Joshua, continued on to the nations that everyone would hear. See, if Abraham had started to build in the land of Canaan, right when God gave him that promised land, Israel would not have been the nation that they were, standing on the edge of the wilderness. God had used all of these things, his plan to turn Israel and make Israel the nation that he wanted them to be. God's plan might have seemed unconventional. It might have not made sense to them, but it was the best way to show Israel who he was and to have them follow him. It was the best way for God to be glorified among the nations. So my question for you today, do you remember that it's God's plan and not your plan? Do you remember that it's God's plan and not your plan? When you look back at your life, have you seen God's hand at work where he's done these things, incredible things, and you're like, I don't understand it, and then you look back after time, you're like, wow, I know why you did that now. Well, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's things we never understand. When I was in seminary, I worked as a summer student for Norwich Township in the Parks Department, and in my 4th summer there, they had a full-time position that opened up. And I met a lot of the qualifications because, again, that was my 4th summer there. I had done the job quite for a while now, and I got along really well with the managers to the point that 4th summer before I started, I went and I said, if I'm going to work here, I need to make more money. And they made a special job to hire me on because they wanted me there that summer. And so I applied for this job, and I was sure I was going to get it, and I didn't. They hired some guy who had to commute an hour and a half. And I was really confused, and I didn't understand it. And a few weeks later, some guy named Robin Pfeiffer at a church called Oxford Baptist decided that they were going to hire me as the part-time youth pastor. See, at the time, I couldn't see God's hand or what exactly he was doing, but looking back, I could see that God was at work. He had a different plan. Sometimes God's plans are different for us, but they are still his plans. We have such a small view compared to God. Remember, God sees all things at all time, outside of time. His view of all creation is incredible. We have such a small view. That doesn't mean that our problems we're facing aren't real. That doesn't mean that the issues we're going through aren't real. But we know that it's all part of God's greater plan because he is a good God. He's seeing things in a different perspective. Right? The famine was not enjoyable during the time of Joseph. The slavery was hard for the people of Egypt while they were there. But God was there, and his plan was so much greater. So I encourage us, remember God's plans. Look back at 2023 and see how God was at work. Spend some time reflecting on that today. Whatever you're struggling through right now, trust that he is in control. Trust that his plans are greater still.